Hello, my name is Mark Seymour. Up until fairly recently I still am a Rick Steves tour guide. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of work at the moment for guides, as you can understand, because of the COVID virus. We're all technically out of work, at least for the time being. No work, no pay, so got to keep myself busy, and the idea was to get out into the lanes, the villages, and into the stone sites that surround me here in Brittany. I am a Brit, I'm British, but I live here in Brittany in western France with my wife, Tony. She is a Rick Steves guide also, and has been for 20 plus years, 23 years now. I have been for nearly 10 years. My domain, of course, is touring and leading tours for Rick Steves across the British Isles. Tony works here in France for him in the same way. In the off-season, I lead my own private tours around the British Isles, around the United Kingdom, and I try to get to little known, out of the way places as much as possible with the use of minibuses. Minibus travel is a great way for small groups. My groups are very, very small, between 4 and 10 people at most. If I need too many buses, I'll have 4 or 5 people in a minibus and 2 guides, so you'll have the benefit of 2 Rick Steves guides, not necessarily Tony, my wife, but one of my colleagues certainly will pair up with me, and we'll go and have some adventures around the countryside of Britain, and we've done tours in France as well. However, now I'm at a bit of a loose end here in France, at least for the time being. I thought it would be a nice thing to do, to share where I live, what I enjoy most of all, and that is the sense of being amongst the stones. The stones. It's a capital T-H-E-S-T-O-N-E-S, the stones. Brittany is full. I mean, absolutely, it is layer-caked with wonderful prehistoric archaeology. Everything from the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, through the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, through the Roman period, and right up until the present day. It's a wonderful layer cake of archaeology. It has been left alone, shall we say, by the industrial world until just the last couple of decades. So much of what has been put there by our forefathers is still there. And one of the enchanting things for me is to be able to take friends, family members to some of the great stone sites, because that is my passion. I love the stones. There's something about them. I cannot tell you right now why they were built, even by whom. Were they built and given a name, passage graves, or were they built and then they became passage graves later, 200 or 300 years later? We don't know for sure. But the beautiful thing is that they are still surrounding me here in this part of Brittany. We have many great sites in Britain and the British Isles generally. Many of those sites have been used or exploited for the benefits of tourism over the last 100 years. Archaeology was cutting edge in the British Isles in the late 1800s. Simply because tourism had become fashionable. The Victorian period meant that a lot of people had a little bit more money and they had a little bit more time, and they could go and visit some of these wonderful places. Here in Brittany, it didn't happen that way. Really, if I was to put a date on it, in the late 60s, tourism became popular here in Brittany, and ever since then, archaeology in this area has flourished. And because of the proliferation of so many large stone sites, the whole vocabulary that we use to describe some of these features all over the world come from Brittany. It's a Breton tongue. You'll hear me say in the video later on, menhir, M-E-N-H-I-R, single standing stone, dolmen, tumuli, chronology. These are all Breton words, not French, Breton. Very independent people here in Brittany. One of the reasons why I enjoy living here, I'm from the southwest of England. My home county is Devon, and it would border Cornwall, and of course there's a sense of independence down there in the same way as I see it here. In fact, they don't produce wine here in Brittany, they produce cider. They eat plentiful apple pie and cream, just as I do, from my neck of the woods, just across the other side of the English Channel in the southwest of England. So, for the time being at least, over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to give you the benefits of being able to access and view some very, very homespun, very raw videos of me walking through the stones. I'll give you explanations of them, I'll elaborate upon some features of these stone sites, And hopefully by the end of the series, they will be a lot more important to you as well, and maybe you'll understand a lot more about them than perhaps you did before. I do want to shed doubts on a lot of the mythology that's grown up around them because of tourism in the 1960s and 1920s in Britain, 1800s in Britain. A lot of myths have occurred around stone sites, alignments with the stars, celestial beings. I'll say right now, hogwash. Unfortunately, you can go and dig up websites which have been there for 20 years, but that will still say the same thing. But I'll give you an example as to how science is changing things. 5-6 years ago, the great new exhibition centre at Stonehenge was created, and I was lucky enough to speak to the curator there as it was being built. And she was very excited about the new panoramic feature, sound and light exhibition, essentially, where they would portray an audio-visual where it looks like you're standing in the middle of Stonehenge, inside the building, the exhibition centre. And the narration was all about the autumnal equinoxes, the solstices. Well, guess what? 1 year after completing the exhibition centre, they deleted the narration. Science now tells us that that was all a crock. It was an invention of the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s in Britain for various purposes, various reasons. Nowadays we rely on science, we rely on technology, we rely on patterns. So what you're going to hear me talking about over the next couple, 3 weeks is, yes, certainly I'll mention the myths. I'll mention some marvellous myths, particularly here in Brittany. But I'm not going to belabor that point. I want you to think of these stones. Imagine you have a clean sheet of paper in your mind and you're going to hear about stones for the very first time. I'll start off slowly. The first episode I'm going to create will be me wandering amongst the stones at Carnac, great UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thousands of stones there, thousands and thousands of stones in a number of alignments that stretch or walk across the landscape in a beautiful way. I'll give you a brief presentation as we wander through some of those, not getting too heavily involved in some of the detail. I will build upon that as the short series progresses. I'm envisioning that this will be 3 videos. How long each one will be, we will see once I finish cutting and editing. I'm not a cinematographer, as you will find out. I'm not a television producer. I'm not an audio specialist. This is me with my iPad doing what I do most of the time when I'm here in Brittany, enjoying the outdoors and enjoying the stones. Please feel free to fire your questions at me through Facebook Messenger or even email. I do have a blog. You'll find links through my Facebook site for that. There is also, these videos are all completely free. They do cost me something to produce. It's an hour and a half drive from here just to Carnac alone. So they cost me a day's outing. So what I have done is given the opportunity, only because I've been asked, there is an opportunity for you to donate if you wish to the upkeep, the production of these short, simple videos. So that's there for you. Please feel free to use it if you wish, but otherwise they are free. There is no obligation to you on that. I want you to enjoy them. I want you to throw your questions at me, and I want you to learn at least a little bit more about the stones. So here I am at the site of Carnac, the alignments of Carnac, UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a site that comprises a number of stone alignments, and they spread all the way around the village of Carnac, which obviously gives its name. When I say alignments, this is what we're talking about. Lines of standing stones, excavated and nowadays open to the public. The alignment of Menac, each black dot represents a standing stone. I'll pan out a little bit, and as we move along the map, the alignment to Camario, Lomagno, the alignments to Kerliscan, the alignments to Betty Menac, and then all the way off the map, there's a new alignment, recently discovered in amongst the woods to the east, several hundred stones, which add to the alignments of Carnac. So we have a site that goes from west to east, that stretches for about 4.5 kilometers, and strangely enough, for every single meter within that 4.5 kilometers, there is a standing stone. About 4,500 at last count. They're adding to them every day, but this is a vast site. Now I want you to look north and south. Much as the archaeologists have dug the site, and we have these stones today, to the north and the south and further to the west and further to the east, there are many, many, many more stones surrounding this area. The whole peninsula of Brittany is covered in megaliths. And as you can see behind me, there's some pretty large stones. Some of these are 30 ton in weight. Massive features on the landscape, and this being the western end of the alignments of Carnac means that the site itself stretches for another 4.5 kilometers in that direction, and we'll explore some of that in a while. If you can hear me breathing heavily, it's because we're walking up towards the site now. We're in lockdown, confinement because of the COVID. But we do have access, we can go into the site. So here we go. So moving into the alignments of Cromario, and as I look to the west, you can see there are some recumbent stones, some stones that are lying down on this side. Were they originally placed that way, or are they a feature or a design, architectural design of our forefathers? We don't know. We don't know. There's so many things about these sites that we don't know the answer to. And I think that's one of the magical things of places like Carnac, of Stonehenge, of Avebury, of Newgrange. Okay, so I hope you're dealing with the poor audio quality. As I say, I'm a complete amateur at this, but stick with it. It really is worthwhile. Also, a few points. I am somebody who loves to teach, but I will repeat. I will repeat and I will repeat. One of the reasons why I do that is I really want certain key points to stick. For instance, I've been discussing already 7,500 years ago. Why? Why am I using that number so frequently? Let's put things in context. Between 12 and 14,000 years ago, much of northern Britain, much of Britain, was covered in a huge sheet of ice, a mile high. Now, south of that, basically most of northern Europe, it was a permafrost. So hard, frozen soil, very little in the way of human life, a few hunter-gatherers. That was 12 to 14,000 years ago. Slowly, as the ice sheets receded and the temperature became warmer, the soil could be cultivated, and of course mankind did learn those skills from their brethren, probably in the Middle East, able to start to domesticate the landscape, not just grains, but also animals, and they became farmers. So we're now talking about a period of 7,500 years ago. Fascinating. How interesting is that? So we have communities of people, extended families, as I refer to in one of the clips, where people are now living together as families and communing together as informal societies. It's from that point on that mankind's evolution in Northern Europe starts to take on a pace. Farming helps people settle, farming helps people gain some sort of health, independence. They could travel further afield. If they can take food with them, they can travel further. They can trade goods. Important aspects to remember, important things to remember. And of course then, with goods and with trading comes a certain amount of prestige. So 7,500 years ago, the Neolithic, I've used that phrase also repeatedly, the New Stone Age. It's also the Megalithic, the Large Stone Age. These things overlap. They can be used in most cases in conjunction with each other. So we move for several thousand years through the Neolithic, eventually arriving at that period that we call the Bronze Age. Now, that's really important to people in Britain because we were a little bit behind the curve with this domestication of the landscape because we were covered in ice for a lot longer. Therefore, that domestication of the landscape started later in the British Isles history. So people started farming in Britain, started to become prolific all over the face of Britain, that's a better way of putting it, and more cultured, shall we say, about 4000 BC, so about 6,000 years ago, 1,000 years later than the period at which we're talking about here in Western France. So their Neolithic is a little bit later. The ideas of great stone building jumped across the English Channel eventually when the climate allowed that to happen. And with the ideas, I'm sure some people moved as well. But the ideas changed. And whereas here in Western France and across much of Western Europe you see single stones or you see great stone alignments, when this idea of change, of moving that knowledge across the English Channel occurred, people evolved the ideas slightly. So no longer in great alignments, they started to create stone circles. You find almost no stone circles here in Western France, almost none, whereas there are 600 known ones in the United Kingdom. Now, I will say that progression it carried on. Eventually, a couple of thousand years later, 1,500 years later, this idea of great stone building jumped across the North Sea and arrived in what we now call Scandinavia. Of course, the idea is stone circles, not stone alignments. But even that concept evolved and changed. So the stone circles became flattened out leaf shapes. So 2,500 BC, 4,500 years ago, right across Scandinavia, leaf-shaped circles, for lack of a better word, are being created in the same way the circles were in Britain, in the same way the stone alignments were thousands of years earlier here in Western France. So it's an evolutionary process. These ideas of great stone building change and adapt. Now, once they've arrived in Scandinavia, the idea of stone building it has adapted. But what's interesting is there's a period there where, again, the landscape is domesticated, the permafrost recedes, people settle in larger and larger communities, and even their sense of society changes somewhat. It comes to a crisis at some point where many of their people decide they have to move. Their young men particularly have to become adventurers, and they use their very effective sailing ships, and they strike out into the North Sea, into the Atlantic Ocean, and carve out a name for themselves. They became known as Norsemen or Vikings. Vikings, it just means anybody basically who's a pirate. It's a very simple translation. But essentially these young men, they set sail from that area that we now call Scandinavia, all over Scandinavia, and they started to find lands or look for lands elsewhere. And they would take what they wanted, essentially, from other settled people, including on the shores of the British Isles, which include, at this point, Ireland. However, they are interested in these leaf-shaped stone circles on their landscape, in the same way that we are today on our stone circles. And we know that they buried many of their dead, many of their great leaders, in their ships. They would recognize the flattened out, rotting hull of a ship in the mud as a leaf. And when their great leaders died, they would bring the remains of their leader and perhaps the ship, and they would place that inside this great leaf-shaped stone circle. Many of the sagas that come from that part of the world talk about giants and people building in stone. Of course, I mean, there's a direct correlation here, isn't there? They're burying their dead in ships that were flattened out inside a stone circle that is the same shape as a hull of a ship would be. So there's a mythology that's developed from that. But as I said before in one of the other clips, there's mythology attached to all of these stone circles. And I will get into that further in subsequent episodes of this, because the mythology here of stone circles in Brittany is fascinating. It's wonderful. So we'll talk about some of those stories attached to some of these sites here at a later date. But anyway, I wanted to get you caught up as to the way I do things and how I do things. Repetition is key. My apologies for the sound quality. Stick with it. It's worth it. And I'll give you these little breaks as well where I can explain or elaborate in more detail on certain things. Why are we here in Brittany? Why is this vast stone site available to us, still standing on the landscape here in Brittany? It's a simple question, but it actually poses many problems for us. used to believe that stone sites, the technology of great stone building, developed in what we call the Middle East, perhaps Iran, Iraq. And the idea of building with great stones spread west to the coast of the Middle East, where what Palestine is today, and then it bounced from island to island across the Mediterranean. The idea of building in stone, massive stones, bounced across the Mediterranean island by island, eventually reaching the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, creeping up around the western coast of Europe, and finding its way here to this triangular peninsula attached to what we now call Western France, Brittany. For some reason, there is a great concentration of stone sites still left here on the landscape. It may be because this is a wilderness area. It may be because it's not an area that has been industrialized in any way, shape or form in the 20th century. It may simply be that there were huge numbers of stones placed here in the first place. To all of the above, we're not sure. What we do know is that here in Western Brittany today, in Western France today, we have the greatest concentration of standing stones. We think perhaps as many as 80% of the world's megaliths, great stones, megalith, we think 80% of them exist here in the peninsula of Brittany, which to me, it's a dream come true. I can explore the stones to my heart's content. They are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. This is Carnac. Carnac is very special. It's a huge site, 4.5 kilometers, as I've said, from one end to the other, from west to east. These stones themselves all come from the local vicinity, no more than about 4 or 5 kilometers away. We'll talk a little bit later on about why and how they were erected, but for the moment I want you just to understand the enormity of this. The whole of this vast area of Western France is covered in standing stones. You've heard of Stonehenge. Some of you have been with me to places like Avebury, Stonehenge. Some of you have been to Newgrange in Ireland. We're talking about 90 or 100 stones. Here at Carnac, right now, there are over 4,500 standing stones, like this. The idea of building large stone, it had crept across the islands. It had arrived here in Western Europe, and it entrenched itself here in this part of northwestern France. We like to think that anyway, because as I said, 80% of the world's standing stones are present here today. Quite probably only because this is still a rural backwater in France. It's becoming popular now amongst the tourist community and amongst Brits moving to France to have a first and second home. But historically, this has been a bit of a backwater. In fact, in Brittany, Bretons themselves have a fierce sense of independence. Corsicans in the south do. Much like in Britain, you find that the Cornish and the Welsh, they have that strong sense of national identity. Here in Brittany, that still prevails as well. So it's been a little bit of a backwater culturally, and certainly as far as technology, industry, farming is concerned, which may be why so many of these sites are still found here in this part of the world. They haven't been ploughed over. They haven't been destroyed. They haven't been dug up and broken up. They haven't been quarried out. These stones are still here, standing on the landscape as they did 7,500 years. They arrived here in Western France after the last ice age. 7,500 years ago, the idea of building in large stones developed. It came, as I said, from the Middle East. Why did they build these great sites? What was the significance? What was the point of them? These stones are large. I'm sitting on a broken one. This is in several pieces here dotted around me. Behind me, there's a vast array of stones in a number of alignments, thousands of them. Why did they go to the effort of doing this? Who were these people? Well, let's go back to the beginning a little bit. We're talking about a period now where people are actually farming, they're domesticating the landscape, they have become used to the landscape, they're extracting more in the way of resources out of it. So much as they wouldn't have been talking about money in the terms we do, these were a wealthy people. We find from grave goods that they had beautifully decorated beads. They had wonderfully made tools, stone tools, but wonderfully made stone tools, things that took time to create. A site like this, as vast as it was, it took time, it took manpower, it took labour, it was an act of patience, but it was industrial in scale. Imagine Carnac, 4.5 kilometers, 4,500 meters long from one side to the other, but probably extending much further than that, north, south, east and west. This is all that remains of it, 7,500 years later. Imagine a landscape in Europe covered in places like this. Now, what we have left today is a tiny fragment of what we had then. These people were industrious. They were creating magnificent features on their landscape, in their environment. What we have left today is a tiny, tiny portion of that. Because of industrialization more recently, because of ploughing, because of building. These places have been quarried out, dug up, disused, and lost. The trees around me here are hiding huge numbers of stones. How many people lived on the landscape then? Well, we used to think in the British Isles, that's where I'm from, as you can tell. In the British Isles, we used to think that in this period, 7,500 years ago, the population of the British Isles would be perhaps 150 to 250,000 people. Hunters, gatherers and farmers. That's not a lot of people for a large piece of land. So we can imagine that this area of Western Brittany probably something less than that in number. However, thanks to new technology, a thing called LiDAR, it's a satellite that runs around the world for all sorts of reasons. It can scan the surface of the globe and it can tell us the depth of plantings. Historically, it can tell us where field systems were, it can tell us where lost communities were on hilltops. We've now changed that number of people, that population size, that population density considerably. The British Isles, we used to think had 250,000 people 7,500 years ago. We now know it had at least 2.5 million people. And that number is going up every single day. The more we discover lost communities, the more we know the population density was greater. So if we extrapolate that information and apply it to Brittany, that's 100, 150,000 people who might have lived in this region at the same time. Let's say there were perhaps somewhere in the low millions of people living in this area. Farming, fishing, this is a coastal area. They would have been a wealthy society, well fed, and were able to sustain a way of life that we don't really understand. Why did they do this? That question, I will keep on throwing it out there. Why did they build these stones? We don't know. I have no answers for you. There have been many ideas based on that concept. Were they in alignment with the stars? Were they built to celebrate harvests and festivals? We don't know. What we do know is that they're not in alignment to the stars. And I'll come back to that in a little while. So population density is important to understand these people. There were many of them essentially. It was a large farming community, 7,500 years ago, farming and fishing. So this was a relatively wealthy society. They had everything that you would expect. Good nutrition essentially was the main thing. Life expectancy, how old did they live? Well, we know from the archaeological record that a good age amongst this community would have been in the low 60s. Average age, we don't know. We don't find enough people, and remains of enough people to actually identify an average age. But probably between 45 and 55 would have been an expected life expectancy. They lived to a good age. They were industrious. They built these great sites. They farmed. They worked. But again,
why were these built? Imagine a village of these people. Stone round houses, perhaps with a thatched roof. Extended family units living within each of those round houses. Every person within that family, extended family, would have had tasks, would have had duties, would have had jobs that they were required to do. Might have been fishing, might have been gutting or skinning, it might have been weaving, might have been making or processing their food in some meaningful way. Everybody would have had tasks which would have helped keep the community alive and thriving. Family grows, it becomes an extended family, more roundhouses. Those extended families grow, eventually you end up with large communities. This is the way life was then. No large towns, no large cities, but some of these communities might have numbered in excess of thousands of people. There's one very famous one on the edge of Dartmoor, Maryvale. We think that perhaps 3,500 people lived there 6,000 years ago. I'll put that into some perspective for you. When William the Conqueror arrived in Britain in 1066, there were almost no communities more than 2,500 people in size. 7,500 years ago, there were communities with 3,500 people. The car go by. So, large populations of people with many skills, multitasks. If you have a large, complex society such as that, you have infrastructure, you have society. Do you have civilization? Probably not in the sense we understand it. That's a word that came along later, courtesy of the Romans. It came along much later. 7,500 years ago, the Romans 2,000 years ago. But these people were organized. If they're organized and they have resources, they probably have time. So they certainly had the time and the manpower with which to build these structures. We know they did because they built them. Think in those terms. These were organized people. They had domesticated the landscape. They will have used beasts of burden. So much as many of these stones are 10, 20 tons in weight, they will have used animals to haul them across the landscape. And also remember what I previously said, these stones did not come from very far away. 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers, they would have been prized out of the ground, where there'd been uplifted rock formations. They could literally find a separated piece of rock strata, wedge some timbers into the cracks, soak the timbers will expand and these rocks will shear off, they will break off. They could then drag these, probably on logs, using beasts of burden to get them to the location they needed them. So we're not talking about a huge scope of work here. This is not an incredible amount of manpower necessary here, but it would have been slow, patient work using beasts of burden. They worked, they played, they died here. On the outskirts of their villages, you will have found their burial sites, tombs. Sometimes, however, they wouldn't look like ours do today. Look behind me. We have a tomb. Here in Brittany, we call them dolmens. Now, very often they would look like this, low, squat structures. Low squat structures, and what this would have looked like when it was originally built would have been a trench in the ground lined with the stones that you see. The upright stones were in a trench, and the capstones would have been placed over the top by dragging them up the sides of the trench and placing them on top of the uprights, inside which you would inter one of your ancestors, one of your family members at the time. Once that was complete, you would cover the whole thing in soil and leave it. What we do know is that these things were very often used over and over and over again. So multiple burials, but from different periods of time. And in fact, here in this area, we find tombs that were reused for more than 3,000 years with the same form of burial. At least a burial. Sometimes a cremation urn would have been placed in here. Sometimes you'd have skeletal remains. Sometimes you'd have disinterred remains or disarticulated remains from different people placed in these sites. They were used as tombs for perhaps thousands of years. Again, the Romans were here 2,000 years ago. A tomb like this might have been used for 3,000-year period. Incredible. They built these structures to last. They built them to use them.
Nowadays you can see Mother Nature has played a part. Erosion, farming, whatever it may be, it's denuded the stone, the soil has been removed, and we can see a dolmen, D-O-L-M-E-N. The language of the stones is interesting because here in Brittany we have a huge number of archaeologists who've been working in places like this for a century and a half. So the language of megalithic archaeology is Breton, the Breton tongue. Dolmen, menhir, and menhir, M-E-N-H-I-R, is a single standing stone. A dolmen is the remains of a tomb. A tumulus, or tumuli, T-U-M-U-L-I, might be a small arrangement of stones. A cromlech will be some form of stone enclosure, but these are all Breton words. Our vocabulary on this subject comes from... So after the Neolithic and the megalithic, what came next? Well, I mentioned it already in the videos. You'll hear me talk about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age began in different parts of Europe at different times. Here in Western France, we are really looking at about 3,500, perhaps even 4,000 BC, 5,500 years ago. In Britain, 3,200 BC, coming to an end with the arrival of the Romans in 800 BC. And of course, I'll rephrase that. Coming to an end with the beginning of the Iron Age in 800 BC. The Romans put an end to all of that. Of course, they arrived in Britain in 43 AD. In this area, 50 or 100 years earlier. But essentially, it brought an end to their Iron Age here as well. So those are your periods of succession. You've got the Neolithic, megalithic. In this part of France, let's say 4,000 BC. Nice round number, 4,000 BC. We have this area going from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. Now, don't think for 1 minute that it just started and stopped, because it didn't. This is a transition, and it might have been a 1,500-year transition in different locations here in Western Europe. But certainly, the Bronze Age began. People started making bronze decorations, bronze bridlery for their horses, simple bronze tools. Very decorative, very, very decorative indeed. But the world had changed, now using metals in larger and larger quantities.
So we're actually standing on the top of the ruin of a windmill, and we're looking to the west. You can see, if I hold the camera steadily, you can see the lines of stone stretching off into the distance. And there's actually some buildings in the middle of them. Imagine owning a house and waking up in the morning and you're surrounded by these wonderful stone sentinels. And off they go, off to the east. Now we're going to follow the trail off to the east a little bit further and point out some other features as we get there. We are quite literally walking amongst the stones, and as you can see ahead of me, see those little white blobs? Those are sheep. Nowadays this is such a large area that they allow the sheep to graze. I just keep the bracken back, keep the gorse and the heather back. Unfortunately, in the act of grazing, these sheep will actually undercut the stones, and at the beginning of the 1900s, many of the stones that you see now, these are small ones in this section, were lying down on the side, or perhaps even buried underneath the gorse and the heather. And it was in the 1920s, 1930s. It was actually a Scotsman who came to this part of the world and archaeologically started to excavate much of the landscape here. He and some comrades in arms, and they decided to start to erect some of these stones on the same spots in which they found them. And they knew certainly by algae growth which direction the stones would be facing, and so these stones are all in their original notches in the ground, and they're all facing the same way. So this site is as it would have been once upon a time. And the stone lines you can see off in the distance there, they're not straight. In fact, we call them alignments because each alignment faces and runs east-west in a slightly different trajectory, slightly different angle. Even though they are almost end-on, they're not in alignment with each other. They don't correlate to the stars, they don't correlate
to anything at least that survives in the landscape today. Much as we think here in Brittany that many of the stones were waypoints and way markers, particularly the single standing stones, the menhirs, you could walk your way across the landscape following those stones. We now think that we're pretty sure that these stones don't correlate to the stars and that they were probably used as some form of waypoint or way marker. However, here at Carnac, it's a different story. The scale of this is completely unprecedented. The joys of living in an area such as Brittany is it is fairly rural. In fact, the hinterland of Brittany is one of the undiscovered gems of Europe. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And wherever you go, you see ancient structures. This is what looks to be probably 15th, 16th century, whatever. It's a little chapel, middle of nowhere. We're walking past it because we're going towards this feature. Cumulus. Cercado, 4,500 years BC, essentially. Okay, so you may remember me describing that tomb back there on the edge of the alignment. This is what that will have looked like. This is Cercado, a tumulus. Here, of course, though, you can see there's still soil mounded up over the passage to the tomb itself. But essentially it's the same thing. There's a cut in the ground, it's lined with great stones, and you can see large heavy capstones on top. Everything then covered over with soil, or in this case a cairn, a rubble pile. And on top of this particular one, at some point in time, they did this. They erected another standing stone, a menhir, on top of the tomb itself. We're going to take a little climb up there. Bear with me, excuse the camera moving around, but this is what we're here to do. There we are. Now we're on top of the burial site. Underneath my feet, somebody once upon a time was buried. So this is a tumulus. Now imagine Mother Nature removing the soil, farmers perhaps removing the soil, and then you would be left with the skeleton of this site, which would be just those standing stones supporting a capped roof. We're approaching the entrance to Cercado, and once we're inside, we can't go very far because there is no light inside, but you'll see what I mean about the upright stones. Remember, this was erected 7,000 years ago, and later on in our travels through the stones of Brittany, I'll show you some other examples of this where there are actually carvings on the stones themselves. So I wanted to point out another feature to you. We've mentioned the vocabulary of archaeology here, the Breton vocabulary. Menhir, remember? A single standing stone. Tumulus, probably a burial site covered over with loose stone and rubble, and then packed over again with soil. And then a dolmen, that is the remains of a tumulus, where you just see the standing stones, perhaps supporting a capstone on the top. So tell me, what is this? Yes, it's a menhir, a single standing stone. Now, very often these days we put importance on some of these larger stones. This one is huge, by the way. It stands about 5 meters tall. We put importance on them because they're isolated. Very often they're impressive. They're almost very phallic, and of course this is some of the mythology that's grown up around them. Were they used in that context? Were they symbols of fertility? Were they used at certain times of year for harvest, festivals and ceremonies? We don't know. We just don't know. But they are still everywhere to be found here on the landscape in Brittany. Single stones standing on their own in the middle of nowhere. Were they originally on their own? We don't know. But certainly this one is, and hundreds of others like it. You'll notice the taper at the top. It's not been carved. That stone has been chosen for its shape. That's interesting because that taper
I was saying earlier on with regards to waypoints and markers. Right? Remember, this is a wooded land, and it all will have been 7,500 years ago. So to find your way through the forest, find your way through the trees, perhaps you would have used these waypoints in the context that you would follow the taper, follow the way it's pointed. They call them actually in Bristol archaeology, they call them pointer stones. And I spend many weekends following the taper of some of these stones across the landscape. Much of it nowadays denuded of trees, but you can follow them stone after stone after stone. As long as you follow the direction of one stone, it will take you to another. Very often there were holes buried or dug underneath them, and we know archaeologically that some of those holes were lined with clay. But if you're going to line a hole with clay, it's to hold water. But I want to emphasise, I mean, this is the Breton landscape. It's a beautiful place to live. There are meadows and fields. It does sometimes feel quite wild, whether you're down on the salt marshes of the coastal areas, or whether you're up in the beautiful deciduous forest in the hinterland. It's a beautiful place to be. But everywhere you go in this portion of western France, there are signs of our prehistoric fathers, our forefathers, people who inhabited this land long before we did. So you can see I'm standing on a bank. There's a tree behind me on a small hill. Over here on my left, as the camera pans around, you'll see some small stone-built, granite-built buildings. This whole area is granite. One of the reasons why the stones have been so durable is they're made of one of the hardest materials on the planet, granite. So, this inconsequential little piece of woodland on a bank, let's go and have a look, see what it hides. I'm going to take you to see a place called the Table de Marchand. It gets its name from the fact that it also had a tabletop-like structure on a small hill. But it's what's inside the hill that I find particularly fascinating. Let's have a look this way. Somebody's old barn, very old. Look at the lintels on the doors there. Several hundred years old is all I would hazard a guess there, but we have another doorway, another entrance, and this is the capstone that I was standing on a moment ago. That's the roof of yet another tomb, a dolmen, and this one actually is the hill that we were standing on. It's a massive structure. It goes way back when. Lighting is poor, but you get a good idea in here of what one of these tombs look like. And if you look on the far wall, you can see inscriptions on the surfaces. And we will explore more about they almost look like hieroglyphs, but these engravings, these stone inscriptions on the walls are quite fascinating. There are patterns there to be discerned. We'll look into those on another day. but I wanted you to see what it's like inside one of these tombs. This has actually been used, I'm sure, for storage, perhaps even as a root cellar by the adjacent barn for centuries. But they're everywhere, and in this part of the world, you can be walking through a copse of trees, you can be walking along a bank, and you'll realise that it's a 100-yard long tomb. They're everywhere. And there's my wife Tony, also a these guys. She's been helping me today film this entire scene. There's the table again. You can almost imagine Bretons coming out at the weekend, sitting, enjoying some sort of festivity on that. But this is just a slab that acts just as a rooftop over somebody's final resting place.
So for the moment, we'll leave it there. I think that's a lot of information. I think there's things for you to mull over. And please, as I said before, ask me your questions via Messenger. I love to answer questions. It makes me think about things too when you ask questions. So please do that. I will respond to as many or all of them if I possibly can. The next episode, I'm actually going to head up to a couple of very different sites. One is called Montneuf, very open site, different geology, therefore the stones themselves are different. The stones that you saw here today, these are granite. We're going up to an area of Brittany, in Middle Brittany, where the geology is schist, and you'll see the shapes of the stones are very, very different indeed, very dramatic as well. A little bit of history, a little bit of detail there as we walk through those stones. I'm also going to take you to see Saint Just, or Saint Just, as we say here in France, Saint Just. To me, it is the most spectacular walking site in Brittany. It's wonderful. You will enjoy it. We will go for a walk. I promise you, have sorted the sound issues out. My apologies for the crackling noise in many of the clips today. We have figured it out. We know what we're doing, and we'll make sure that's eradicated for the next episode. Meanwhile, I wish you well. Ask me your questions. I will do my best to inform and help. It's a vast subject. It is an interesting subject. And of course, your forefathers were the same people who built the stones as were my forefathers. So think about that. I will leave this video up on my website, on my Facebook post, and my blog for a number of weeks, so you can come and go if you wish. As I say, all donations gratefully accepted. Anything will help at this moment in time. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, stay happy. I will notify you of the next video. It will be up and available to you next Saturday morning at the very latest. Just keep checking back to my blog, to my Facebook site, or you should see a notification on your own Facebook site. If you have friended me already, you should see notification that this video is available to you. All right, thank you very much. Lots of love from Brittany, from both Tony and myself, and we'll see you soon.